Hey guys, welcome back to Look and Live, the channel where at the moment every week we're asking the question, what is God like? And looking at different picture language, metaphors, similes that God himself gives us to describe what he is like. And this week we're going to be looking at the character of Joseph from the book of Genesis, who is the great-grandson of Abraham, the son of Jacob, who becomes called Israel. We talked about him last week, so go see last week's video if you haven't seen that. And it's another story about brothers, so go see Christ Our Brother video if you haven't seen that, because that kind of sets up this whole little mini-series I've done of different brothers in the Bible and their relationships, and what that can tell us about God and God's relationship to us. But the basics is that God became our brother. He joined our family so that we could join his family. So go see that Christ Our Brother video first if you haven't seen that. So we jump in on Joseph. I think Joseph becomes the main character of Genesis, and I think arguably, apart from God Almighty, he may be the main character of Genesis overall. And I say that, I think he might have the most space dedicated to him, to the most words dedicated to him. Could be wrong, it might be Abraham, I haven't actually calculated it, but he's got a lot. Anyway, he's a big main character in Genesis, and here we go. So I'm going to tell a bit of Joseph's story, and then we're going to see what that has to tell us about God himself. So, Joseph is one of many brothers, 11 or 12 brothers of this guy Israel, whose other name is Jacob. And he's one of the youngest, and he's with the favourite wife. Jacob's tricked into having two wives by his father-in-law, into having a wife he didn't want. He has lots of kids with the one he didn't want, and only a couple with the wife he did want. So here we go. Joseph is one of the younger sons, and he's with Jacob's favourite wife, and he's one of the favourites. He is the favourite, actually, at the time. And Israel, his father, dotes on him, looks after him, puts him above his brothers, gives him this wonderful coat, which is very famous in the story, the coat of many colours, or the whatever else you want to call it. He gives him a cloak, which is a big deal for a man at the time. It's an important piece of clothing, very useful, take a lot of time and energy to make, but also his was a special one. It was possibly very ornate, possibly longer and better. It's a big symbol of his father's favouritism of him that he wears this coat. And Joseph has these dreams as a teenager that he's better than everyone. He has these dreams of various imagery, but the meaning of those images is that one day his brothers and his father and mother are going to all come and bow down to him. He will stand up tall and they'll all bow to him and be like his servants. His brothers don't like him. They get very angry with him and they start plotting against him. They're out in the fields with the sheep. Occasionally he goes out there, but he's home a lot of the time. He's a bit spoiled, I would say. And they plot against him. They hate him because he's a favourite, because the father pours all this favour and affection onto Joseph, and not onto them, while they're working hard. They are very upset with him. And they get a bit extreme. They hate him because they really want their father's affection. So they plot to kill him. And there's a couple of restraining brothers. Judah and Reuben try to restrain the group a bit, and they say, let's not kill him, let's just leave him for dead, Reuben says. Judah says, let's not kill him, let's just enslave him. Let's sell him as a slave. And in the end, that's what they do. A bunch of Ishmaelites come through, which is another interesting connection to brotherly rivalries. If you follow the story Ishmael and Isaac, that's a big brotherly rivalry. And Ishmaelites come through, and they sell him as a slave. He ends up in Egypt. He is sold in Egypt as a slave to a guy called Potiphar, who is an important guy. I think he's captain of the guard or something like that for Pharaoh. And Joseph has God's favour on his life. It says God is with him. Yahweh was with him. And even though Joseph is sold as a slave, brought into this foreign land, he is diligent and God looks after him, and he becomes very important in Potiphar's house. He becomes the top slave, and he looks after everything Potiphar has. Potiphar's wife wants to sleep with Joseph. He won't do it. In the end, she falsely accuses him of inappropriate sexual behaviour with her, and he gets sent to prison on that false accusation. So again, Joseph's been turned into slavery, and he becomes head of the household in Potiphar's house. Then he's falsely accused, and in prison, some of the people have dreams, and Joseph says, well, God can interpret dreams, the true God, and Joseph interprets their dreams correctly. Eventually, a couple of years later, Pharaoh has a dream, One of the people who was in prison with Joseph has been released, as Joseph said he would, from his dream. And Pharaoh has this dream, and this guy suddenly remembers Joseph and the dream interpreting. And he was supposed to tell Pharaoh about Joseph and get him out of jail, but he didn't. Anyway, a couple of years later, Joseph had been in jail 2 years longer than he needed to be. This guy, I should say in jail, he also worked his way up to being important and in charge of things in jail, because it says Yahweh was with him, God was with him. Pharaoh hears about his dream interpreting ability, brings Joseph there. Joseph says, well, I can't do it, but God can. And by God's power, Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams and warns of a famine to come in the land, of 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh appoints Joseph to be prime minister, to be the top dog over the whole land, apart from Pharaoh. So apart from one guy, he is in charge of the entire land. He's the second in command over one of the biggest empires of the time in the world, a superpower in the region. And through this, he's able to prepare the land for the famine and save many, many people from the famine, save them from dying because of his wisdom and because of God's favour on his life. Pharaoh is astonished at the Spirit of God in Joseph, puts him in charge, and he saves the land. And at this point in the famine, his family come from Canaan, where they live, and they come to look for grain in Egypt. And Joseph tests them a bit, but in the end, they reconcile. And he has some very interesting things to say to his brothers about what happened. So it's quite a long story, but it takes up quite a large chunk of Genesis. But there's a lot of beautiful things in there, which are parallels between us and God and how we can understand what God is like to us. So we're going to go back to the same thread we've been following for the past several weeks, which is favourite brothers and unfavourite brothers. And I'll keep saying this, but I'll say it again. Often when we see a favourite brother, that can be an image of Christ, of Jesus, who is God himself. So Jesus is the favourite son. And Joseph here is the favourite son in our story. So we're saying Jesus is like Joseph. And Joseph kind of acted like he was superior to his brothers in some ways. And he had these dreams about them all bowing down to him. They really didn't like that. They hated it because they thought he was arrogant. They thought he was putting himself above them. And it's the same with Jesus. Jesus came to earth saying that he was God himself, saying that he had authority to forgive sins, saying that he was the rightful king of Israel, saying many, many more things about how he was God and how he was king. And because of this, people hated him. They said, you're not above us. You know, you're on the same level of us. And because of this perceived superiority complex, Joseph was killed by his brothers. Well, he wasn't actually quite killed. They were going to kill him, and they nearly did. They told his dad they killed him, but they didn't actually quite kill him. They sold him as a slave. But because of Jesus' supposed superiority complex, Jesus was actually killed. They plotted against him like Joseph's brothers, but Jesus was actually killed. He was hated, and he was actually killed, although he wasn't delivered over to death because he came out of it, just like Joseph came out of his predicament. So that's the first thing. Favourite brother is favoured by God, in Jesus' case, favoured by his father, in Joseph's case, and people don't like him because of it. They think he thinks he's better than them, and so they have to get rid of him. That's a common thread. We've had that all the last few weeks. But here we go. The other thing, the next thing I'd say that's common between Jesus and Joseph is that you can't keep a good man down. Joseph has God's favour. It says the Spirit of Yahweh was with him. Pharaoh recognises that. And it's an amazing truth that every time something seems to go badly wrong in Joseph's life, actually it works out that thing leads him to a better position. He actually becomes better off through the horrible things that happen to him. He is enslaved and he becomes the head of a household. And then he's thrown into prison and he becomes basically the head prisoner, the one who looks after everything in the prison. And then from that he becomes almost head of entire nation, which is an empire, great empire of Egypt. So all these bad things keep happening to Joseph, and they all actually keep leading to him becoming better off, and particularly to him leading and ruling in authority, from him being cast down to a place of being a servant or a slave. And this is exactly the same with Jesus. Jesus had the Spirit of God on him, and Jesus had God on his side in a way that no one else ever will, in a sense, because he was God and he had the Holy Spirit on him. That bad things happen to Jesus, and particularly, really, just talking about his death here, really, the plot against him and his crucifixion, they intended to humiliate him. They intended to strip him, just like Joseph was stripped of his robe. And Joseph was stripped of his power and his status. Jesus was stripped of his power and his status. He was mocked. He was physically, brutally tortured. And he was actually robbed of his life. He was killed and he was put in the ground and sealed behind a stone. And the intention was to take away all his power and his status and his favouritehood. But the actual effect was the reverse. The crucified and resurrected Jesus says to his disciples, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." That on that cross, while he wore a crown of thorns which was intended to mock him, he was actually becoming enthroned and crowned as the king of the kingdom of heaven. As they put a sign above his head on the cross to mock him, saying, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews," to mock him, to say, "Oh, what kind of a king is this?" They put a purple robe on him to mock him and say, "What kind of a stupid king are you?" Just as Joseph was torn down by those around him for being righteous, torn down for being the favourite, exactly the same thing happens to Jesus. He's falsely accused like Joseph. But God is using all these very same things to make him king, to give him authority and to give him power, through him becoming a slave, through him becoming weak, through all these awful things. It's not even, and notice this is very profound, and I hope I can convey it well, that it's not just in spite of the bad things, but it's actually because of them that Jesus becomes ruler. It's actually because of the bad things that Joseph gets into the position he's in, that he's lifted up when they try to push him down. It's not just in spite of them, but it's actually because of them. They actually put him into situations and put him in a place where he wouldn't have been otherwise. If he hadn't been sold into slavery, he would never have become the ruler, or almost ruler, of all of Egypt. And what's the point of all of this? Why is it important that he became ruler? Why is it important that Joseph became ruler and that Jesus became ruler? Well, I think it's Joseph sums up at the end of his life to his brothers. But first, when they come back, he sums it up to them, and then at the last words he says, almost in Genesis, well, they are the last words he says that men meant this for evil, but God meant it for good, that many may be saved. And in Joseph's time, he saved many people from famine. He saved the whole land of Egypt, and he saved, obviously, many neighbouring peoples were coming as well for food and help. But Jesus, so that those people would have died without Joseph. But Jesus doesn't just save us from death from famine, but he actually saves us from death in its most true sense, which is not just physical death, although that's important. Jesus does also save us from physical death because he promises resurrection. But he also saves us from spiritual death, separation from God. Jesus takes us from spiritual famine, where we just, our soul's crying out, just give us a morsel of something to feed on, and we can feel spiritually poor and spiritually hungry, and Jesus saves us from that. Absolutely. Through all this suffering, through all these seemingly awful things that happen to him, which are awful, they are bad things, and men intended them for harm, but God intended them for good, to save many. We see that in Joseph, that through all the bad things he became Prime Minister of Egypt, and he was able to save a multitude from famine. But Jesus, through all the plots against him, which came together in his crucifixion, he was able to save a multitude from spiritual famine, from spiritual death, and from physical death, because we will be resurrected to live with him forever. So I hope I've made that clear. There's a whole lot of information in there. I knew this wouldn't be a short one this week. I'll try and summarise a few points now, and then I'll just say goodbye. As always, thanks for joining. So what's the few points? Jesus is like a favourite son, just like Joseph. He's not spoilt like Joseph, but he's the one that we hate irrationally. We hate because he seems better than us. We hate because he's favoured, he seems superior. And Potiphar's wife even hated him because he was righteous, because he wouldn't do evil. And that's the same with Jesus. And just like Joseph, Jesus can't be kept down. All the bad things that happen to him propel him upwards, actually, not downwards. And just like Joseph, the bad things that happened to him were actually God doing good things. And it's the same with Jesus, that the bad things that human beings did to Jesus were actually good things that God was intending to do through Jesus for our salvation. So thanks for joining me, guys. Always great to have you along. Please do comment. I hope that's not too confusing. Let me know if it is confusing, and let me know if it's clear, and let me know if there's anything new to you or anything that just hit home. I think it's so beautiful, this stuff that God has woven into, not just into literature, but into history, these images of himself. These real human beings like Joseph, who are a picture of Jesus, our brother. Jesus, our brother, our favourite brother, who came down to bless us. So thanks for joining. I'll highlight the paintings in a second. But love you guys. Thanks for tuning in. Tune in next week. I think I might stop doing brothers next week, so we might move on to a different family relationship. Watch out. Good stuff. Love you guys. God bless. Just finished editing this video, and there were lots of other things I wanted to add in, but I think what's there is good and solid. Here's an old painting of my wife's, but the bigger ones and the newer ones which are available. So go see the description for a link to her Instagram and her email if you want to get in touch for commissions or prints or original paintings. Thanks for joining me, guys, and see you next time.